While Patricia Neal hemorrhages on a squalid back alley operating table, the legitimate wife, Rocky Cooper, savors a venomous, triumphant cup of tea in her multi-million-dollar fortress. In Hollywood's most savage love triangle, Rocky weaponized her elite social power to ruthlessly annihilate Patricia, while Gary Cooper, the spineless American hero, shoved his desperate lover into a forced abortion with a wad of hush money. Two women chained within the same festering abyss, the victor aggressively guarding the rotting corpse of a marriage, and the broken mistress condemned to decades of trauma, both sacrificed to preserve a despicable coward's hypocritical facade. The myth of Gary Cooper was a beautifully constructed facade built to hide a remarkably passive man. Born Frank Cooper, he possessed the rugged exterior of an American cowboy, but behind the stoic gaze was a man paralyzed by insecurity and a pathological fear of poverty. He found his anchor in Veronica "Rocky" Balfe. A fiercely powerful Wall Street heiress, Rocky didn't just marry a movie star, she built an empire around him. She purged his chaotic past, introduced him to the East Coast elite, and engineered his unassailable public respectability. In their Brentwood mansion, she ruled with an absolute quiet authority. Cooper, terrified of her disapproval, accepted a heavily fortified marriage where his discreet dalliances were quietly tolerated, only as long as they never threatened the pristine life she had built for him. Into this perfectly calibrated machinery walked Patricia Neal. If Cooper was an artificial construct, the 21-year-old theatrical prodigy was raw, unfiltered reality. Cast opposite the aging national monument in the Fountainhead, she possessed a ferocious emotional honesty that Hollywood could not manufacture. When the cameras stopped rolling, the isolation of the soundstage exposed the cracks in Cooper's armor. He dropped his stoic persona, revealing a profound, suffocating loneliness to a woman 25 years his junior. Their love triangle quickly devolved into a suffocating trap. Crushed under the flawless monument his wife had built, Cooper used Neal's youthful passion as an emotional landfill. He extracted her vitality and wept over his domestic captivity, yet remained firmly tethered to his millions. Neal, blinded by theatrical idealism, absorbed his misery. She believed she was rescuing a captive hero from a cold, loveless marriage, failing to understand the foundational law of his existence. Gary Cooper lacked the courage to leave his golden cage, and the wife who owned the key was already watching from the shadows, quietly preparing to crush the girl who dared to trespass on her property. For Patricia Neal, the heavy bakelite telephone became an instrument of psychological torture. It was anchored to the wall, heavy, black, and completely devoid of privacy. For Patricia Neal, living in a rented Hollywood apartment, that piece of molded bakelite became an instrument of psychological torture. When the filming of The Fountainhead concluded, the artificial ecosystem of the soundstage collapsed. The forced proximity that had allowed their affair to bloom was replaced by the rigid, highly monitored geography of Gary Cooper's actual life. The affair transitioned from a shared physical reality into a ghost story told over copper wires. Gary Cooper returned to the fortress in Brentwood. He returned to Veronica "Rocky" Balfe. He returned to the schedule dictated by the studio and curated by his wife. He was a man who required constant management, and he surrendered back into the machinery of his own domesticity with the passive compliance of a corporate employee clocking in for a shift. Patricia Neal, meanwhile, was left in the agonizing position of the other woman, a role defined entirely by its lack of autonomy. In the power dynamic of an illicit affair, the person who holds the institutional power dictates the timeline. Gary Cooper chose when to call. He chose when it was safe. He chose when he had an hour to spare between a script reading and a society dinner. Patricia had no choices. She could only wait. She stopped leaving her apartment. If she went to the grocery store, she might miss his call. If she met friends for a drink, she might miss the brief 10-minute window when Gary could slip away to a payphone. Her entire existence, her brilliant, raw, theatrical energy was reduced to a state of perpetual vibrating suspense. She was a 23-year-old woman putting her youth into a holding pattern for a 48-year-old man who was already owned by someone else. Gary Cooper chose when to call, usually from a noisy payphone with a fistful of coins. His voice was always a whisper of desperation. He complained about his marriage, about Rocky's coldness, and the suffocating pressure of his fame. He dumped his anxieties onto Patricia, extracted her vitality, and then hung up, returning to his mansion feeling lighter. Patricia absorbed his misery, mistaking his complaints for a promise of departure. She didn't realize that Gary Cooper didn't want to leave his wife. He simply wanted to inhabit two conflicting realities without paying the toll for either. To sustain this illusion, Cooper utilized the primary weapon of the passive man, the written word. Unable to offer Patricia a public life, he offered her paper. He wrote her letters, hundreds of them. These letters have often been romanticized by Hollywood historians as evidence of a great tragic love. A forensic reading reveals them to be something entirely different. They are documents of cowardice. In his letters, Cooper was brave. In ink, he was the hero of High Noon. He wrote of a future together. He wrote of his undying devotion. He promised her children. He promised her a home far away from the toxic machinery of Los Angeles. He wrote these things precisely because writing them meant he didn't have to do them. A letter is a safe, contained environment. It requires no immediate action. It triggers no legal consequences. It does not initiate a divorce proceeding under California's community property laws. For Cooper, writing to Patricia was a pressure valve. It allowed him to play the role of the tragic imprisoned lover without ever testing the locks on his cage. For Patricia, however, those letters were legal tender. She was a stage actress. She believed in the sanctity of the text. She read his promises and took them as literal blueprints for their future. She read them at night, memorized them, and used them to build a psychological fortress against the isolating reality of her daily life. She was building a house out of paper, while the man who provided the paper was living in a concrete mansion funded by a Wall Street heiress. The affair continued in the shadows throughout 1949. It was a logistical nightmare. They could not be seen at the Brown Derby. They could not attend premieres. They met in the back corners of dimly lit restaurants chosen for their obscurity, arriving in separate cars. They utilized the homes of trusted, silent friends like the actor Peter Lorre, who understood the omerta of the studio system. It was an exhausting, paranoid existence. It eroded Patricia's nerves. The stress of hiding, combined with the guilt instilled by her own conventional upbringing, began to physically alter her. She lost weight. Her face, usually so expressive and vibrant, took on a haunted, brittle quality. The studio executives at Warner Brothers noticed the change. They didn't care about her emotional state. They cared about her lighting. They complained that she was looking haggard on film. The asset was depreciating. The pressure of maintaining this dual life inevitably leads to a desire for normalization. When you live in a submarine for long enough, you desperately want to see the sun, even if it means risking exposure. This desperate desire for a moment of ordinary, unhidden existence led to the fatal miscalculation of Christmas, 1949. The catalyst was not a rival or a private investigator. It was a friendly, naive journalist named Harvey Orkin. Orkin moved in the periphery of the Hollywood elite. He liked Gary. He liked Patricia. He was aware of the rumors, but in the incestuous, morally flexible world of the film industry, affairs were as common as script revisions. Orkin suggested a trip, a holiday. He and his wife were going to Aspen, Colorado for a ski trip. He casually invited Gary and Patricia to join them. It was an insane proposition. Taking a public vacation as an illicit couple was a violation of every survival protocol in the Hollywood handbook. But the offer was intoxicating. Aspen in 1949 was not yet the paparazzi-infested billionaire playground it is today. It was a remote, quiet, affluent enclave. To Gary and Patricia, it sounded like a parallel universe, a place where they could walk outside in the daylight, breathe clean air, and pretend just for a few days that they were a normal couple. Cooper, displaying a stunning lack of self-preservation, agreed. He told Rocky he was going on a hunting or skiing trip with friends, a standard excuse for the era's husbands. The Aspen trip was, temporarily, exactly what they had fantasized it would be. Away from the smog of Los Angeles and the terrifying gaze of the studio bosses, the tension evaporated. They skied. They drank by the fire. They laughed without looking over their shoulders. There's a photograph from this trip that captures the exact vibration of their delusion. They are standing in the snow, leaning against each other. Gary looks genuinely relaxed. The heavy, anxious lines around his eyes softened. Patricia looks radiant, her guard completely down. They were not acting, and that was the problem. When actors play lovers on screen, it is a performance of passion. It is loud and visible, but genuine intimacy is quiet. It is found in the micro-expressions. It is the way a man hands a woman a cup of coffee. It is the casual, unthinking proximity of two bodies that are entirely comfortable with each other. In Aspen, Gary and Patricia stopped hiding. They let their biological guard down. They allowed the invisible tether between them to become visible to anyone paying attention. And someone was always paying attention. Hollywood is not a town. It is an intelligence network. Information is the primary currency. A star of Gary Cooper's magnitude does not travel anywhere without being observed. While they were playing house in the snow, the machinery of surveillance was silently recording their movements. It didn't require a coordinated conspiracy. It only required a hotel clerk who recognized a face, a wealthy tourist from Los Angeles, who noticed the way the American hero looked at the young actress from Warner Brothers, or a stray photograph taken by a society reporter. The specific vector of the intelligence leak is irrelevant. What matters is that the data was collected, processed, and transmitted back to the one person who possessed the authority to act on it. Back in Brentwood, Veronica Rocky Balfe sensed the shift immediately. According to Hollywood insiders, Rocky was an aristocrat of observation. She had spent a decade and a half managing Gary Cooper. She knew his rhythms, his moods, and his tells better than he knew them himself. When Cooper returned from Aspen, he walked through the heavy oak doors of his mansion as a changed man. The change was not dramatic. He didn't confess. He didn't smell of cheap perfume. But he was different. The baseline anxiety that usually hummed beneath his skin was gone. He was too calm. He was too polite. He possessed the terrifying serenity of a man who has successfully outsourced his emotional life. Rocky Balfe looked at her husband and ran a diagnostic check. She factored in the rumors she had undoubtedly heard from her vast network of society friends. She recalled the late nights during the filming of The Fountainhead. She calculated the sudden, convenient ski trip with Harvey Orkin. The pieces locked into place. The equation was solved. Gary Cooper was not just having a physical dalliance. He had formed an emotional attachment. He was in love with Patricia Neal. Most women, upon realizing their husband is deeply involved with a woman 25 years his junior, would experience a catastrophic emotional collapse. There would be screaming. There would be broken porcelain. There would be threats of divorce. Rocky Balfe did none of these things. Rocky did not view the affair merely as a romantic betrayal, but as a severe threat to the life she had meticulously built. Operating with the cold pragmatism of her elite upbringing, she didn't panic, scream, or throw porcelain. She deployed the most terrifying weapon she possessed: absolute silence. She did not confront Gary. She did not ask him where he had been or who he had been with. She simply altered the atmospheric pressure of the house. She became impeccably, terrifyingly perfect. She managed the staff with clinical precision. She organized society dinners with the highest echelons of the Los Angeles elite, studio heads, politicians, Catholic bishops. She forced Gary to sit at the head of the table, smiling, playing the role of the devoted patriarch, while he knew that she knew he was a fraud. She was silently demonstrating the infrastructure of his life. She was showing him the sheer monolithic weight of the world she had built for him. She was making him acutely aware of exactly what he would lose if he dared to leave her. She knew Gary Cooper. She knew his paralyzing fear of poverty. She knew that he was terrified of her stepfather, Paul Shields, who could financially ruin him with a phone call. She knew that under California law, a divorce initiated on the grounds of adultery would cost him half of his multi-million-dollar estate. Rocky didn't need to scream at him. She simply let the math do the talking. She also began to subtly, invisibly cut off his escape routes. Without ever raising her voice, she tightened her control over his schedule. She required his presence at more public events. She ensured that he was photographed with her and their daughter, Maria, frequently. She was reinforcing the brand. She was building a wall of public respectability so high and so thick that Gary Cooper, a man of profound inertia, would never have the energy to climb over it. While she was suffocating Gary with domestic perfection, Rocky turned her cold, calculating gaze toward the external threat: Patricia Neal. Rocky did not view Patricia as a rival. To view someone as a rival implies they are on equal footing. Rocky viewed Patricia as an infection, an ambitious, theatrical infection from a lower class that had attached itself to her property. And like any infection, it needed to be sterilized. Rocky understood that confronting Patricia directly would be a tactical error. It would legitimize the girl. It would give Patricia a story. It would turn a corporate extermination into a catfight. Rocky Balfe did not engage in catfights. She utilized the power of the state. In Hollywood, the state was the studio system, the press, and the social elite. Rocky picked up the telephone. She did not call Patricia. She called her friends. She called the wives of the studio executives. She called the society columnists who relied on her for access to the true upper crust. She did not spread vicious, explicit rumors. She was far too refined for that. She simply expressed with a tone of patrician sorrow her concern for Gary. She hinted that he was being manipulated by a highly aggressive, unstable young woman. She painted a picture of a good man being targeted by a predator. In the highly calibrated ecosystem of 1950s Hollywood, a whisper from Rocky Balfe was a localized earthquake. The warning was received, decoded, and acted upon immediately. The industry operated on a strict hierarchy. Given the choice between offending the wife of its biggest star and protecting a young actress, the studios did not hesitate. The machinery of isolation was activated. For Patricia, the change was imperceptible at first, then absolute. The warm, collaborative environment she had experienced at Warner Brothers suddenly turned glacial. Scripts that had been promised to her were suddenly going in a different direction. Directors who had praised her theatrical genius suddenly found her too difficult to light or too intense for the picture. She walked onto the studio lot and felt the temperature drop. People stopped making eye contact. The hair and makeup girls, usually the friendliest people on set, became brisk and silent. In the commissary, she found herself eating alone. The invisible, impenetrable barrier of the Hollywood blacklist had descended around her. Not for her politics, but for her proximity to power she did not understand. She was being systematically starved of oxygen, and the most terrifying part was that nobody would tell her why. Nobody yelled. Nobody accused her. The doors simply closed one by one with a quiet, definitive click. She was completely isolated. She had no allies. Her stage friends in New York were 3,000 miles away. Her lover was locked inside his Brentwood fortress, too terrified of his wife to intervene. Patricia was trapped in a city that had collectively decided she no longer existed, and Rocky Balfe was just getting started. The economic and professional starvation of Patricia Neal was merely the first phase of the operation. It was the softening of the target, the true devastating strike, the strike that would aim directly at Gary Cooper's psychology and shatter Patricia's spirit entirely, was currently being prepared. Rocky was about to deploy a weapon against which there was no defense. She was about to weaponize the concept of family itself. The devastating cruelty of Rocky's next move struck at the most vulnerable aspect of Cooper's life, the unshakable adoration of his 11-year-old daughter, Maria. Rocky systematically directed her influence to shatter that bond, turning the child's pure love into a weapon against her own father. Maria Cooper worshipped him. To a child, Gary Cooper was not an actor playing a hero. He was the hero. He was the tall, quiet man who brought her presents from film sets, who taught her how to ride horses on their sprawling ranch properties, and whose face was projected on screens 30 feet high, embodying everything good and pure about America. Her entire understanding of masculine virtue was inextricably linked to her father's mythology. Rocky knew exactly how heavily Gary relied on his daughter's adoration. It was the only pure, uncomplicated affection in his highly curated, transactional life. It was the mirror in which he could look at himself and believe that he was, despite his infidelities and cowardice, a fundamentally good man. If that mirror were to shatter, the Gary Cooper myth would collapse inward. The standard protocol for a mother in a failing marriage during the 1950s was to shield the children from the ugly realities of adultery. Divorce, if it happened, was explained away as a mutual incompatibility. The details of mistresses and betrayals were strictly classified, locked behind the heavy oak doors of the master bedroom. But Rocky Balfe was not operating under standard protocols. She was fighting a war of attrition. On a quiet afternoon in the Brentwood mansion, Rocky sat her 11-year-old daughter down. This was not a tearful, emotional confession of a heartbroken mother. It was a briefing. With the cold, precise articulation of a corporate litigator, Rocky dismantled the myth of Gary Cooper for her child. She did not spare the details. She told Maria about the affair. She told her about the younger woman, the actress who was trying to destroy their family. She painted Patricia Neal not just as a homewrecker, but as a hostile entity attempting to steal Maria's father and dismantle their secure, privileged world. The psychological violence of this act is staggering. Rocky took the foundational security of an 11-year-old girl and detonated it simply to win a chess match against her husband. She uploaded her own rage, her own territorial panic, into the mind of a child. The result was instantaneous and catastrophic. Maria's hero worship inverted into pure, unadulterated hatred. The trauma of discovering that your father is a fraud, that the man who embodies American morality is a liar sneaking around with a girl only 12 years older than you, is a psychological wound that does not heal. Maria felt a profound territorial betrayal. She allied entirely with her mother, the apparent victim, and directed a lethal, concentrated fury toward her father. When Gary Cooper returned home, expecting the usual tense but polite atmosphere Rocky had manufactured, he walked into an ambush. He did not face a weeping wife, he faced an 11-year-old girl vibrating with rage. The details of the confrontation remain shielded by the Cooper family's historical omerta, but the outcome was undeniable. Maria reportedly screamed at him. She told him she hated him. She told him he was disgusting, that he was destroying their family, and that she never wanted to see him again. She wielded his own guilt against him with a precision only a child mimicking her mother could achieve. For Gary Cooper, this was not a domestic argument. It was a total system failure. The man who could stare down a gang of outlaws on a movie set without blinking possessed no defense mechanisms against the tears and hatred of his own daughter. His ego, fragile and entirely dependent on external validation, fractured. The illusion of his own righteousness was stripped away, leaving him exposed as exactly what he was, a middle-aged man risking his family's stability for a physical infatuation. This was Rocky's masterpiece. She had successfully shifted the battlefield. Gary was no longer fighting his wife for his freedom. He was fighting his daughter for his soul. And Rocky knew that Gary Cooper did not have the stamina for that kind of war. He was a man of profound inertia, facing the absolute rejection of his child, the crushing weight of his Catholic guilt, and the terrifying prospect of dismantling his billion-dollar public image. The fire of his rebellion began to suffocate. He did not immediately end the affair with Patricia. His cowardice prevented him from taking definitive action in either direction. Instead, he retreated into a state of emotional paralysis. He continued to call Patricia, but the calls changed. The desperate promises of a future together were replaced by a looping, agonizing narrative of his own suffering. He told Patricia about Maria's hatred. He cried on the phone, transferring the unbearable weight of his guilt onto the shoulders of the 23-year-old woman waiting in a rented apartment. Patricia, blinded by her belief in romantic sacrifice, absorbed this pain. She thought she was comforting a wounded lion. She did not realize she was acting as a shock absorber for a man who had already decided to surrender. She interpreted his tears as evidence of his love, failing to understand that Gary Cooper was not crying because he couldn't be with her. He was crying because he had been caught and because the price of being with her was higher than he was willing to pay. While Gary was crumbling under the weight of his daughter's engineered hatred, Rocky initiated the second phase of her familial assault. If Maria was the emotional weapon used to paralyze Gary, the next weapon was designed to humiliate Patricia and establish an impenetrable class barrier. Enter Alice Cooper, Gary's mother. Alice Cooper's desperate grasp on aristocracy fueled her specific brand of cruelty towards her son's lover. Alice was an English immigrant who had settled in Helena, Montana, with Gary's father, Charles, a lawyer who eventually became a state Supreme Court justice. Despite living in the rugged American West, Alice maintained the rigid, class-obsessed pretensions of the English upper middle class. She sent Gary to be educated at Dunstable School in Bedfordshire, desperate to scrub the Montana dirt from him and instill the manners of an English gentleman. When Gary became a massive Hollywood star, Alice's social ambitions were fully realized. She relocated to Los Angeles and established herself as a formidable matriarch in the city's elite circles. She viewed the film industry with a mixture of reliance and disdain. She enjoyed the immense wealth and status it provided her son, but she viewed the actors, directors, and contract players as working-class labor. When Gary married Rocky Balfe, Alice was overjoyed. Rocky was not an actress. She was a Wall Street heiress. She possessed the blue blood pedigree that Alice worshipped. The alliance between the English matriarch and the New York socialite was absolute. They shared a common goal: the protection and elevation of the Gary Cooper asset. When Alice was informed of the affair with Patricia Neal, undoubtedly briefed by Rocky with the same surgical precision used on Maria, her reaction was rooted in pure class warfare. To Alice, Patricia was not just a threat to her son's marriage. She was a terrifying biological and social downgrade. Patricia was a girl from a mining town in Kentucky, a theater actress who worked for a living, a woman who possessed none of the refinement, wealth, or Catholic respectability of Rocky Balfe. Alice Cooper viewed Patricia Neal as an aggressive lower-class parasite attempting to latch onto her son's fortune. And in the brutally hierarchical world of Los Angeles high society, Alice possessed the power to make her contempt public and absolute. The execution took place under the guise of civility, which is the preferred method of assassination for the upper classes. It was the spring of 1950. Despite the immense pressure from Rocky, Gary was still clinging to the affair, operating in a state of terrified limbo. In a stunning display of either delusion or desperate appeasement, he suggested that Patricia should meet his mother. Gary likely believed that if Alice could just meet Patricia, she would see the brilliant, vibrant woman he loved, and the hostility would thaw. He was applying the logic of a movie script to a reality governed by corporate protectionism. Patricia, desperate for any sign of legitimacy, agreed. She viewed this meeting as a pivotal victory, a sign that Gary was finally integrating her into his real life. She prepared for the meeting with the anxiety of a soldier stepping onto a minefield. She dressed meticulously, choosing an outfit that was conservative, elegant, and devoid of theatrical flair. She wanted to prove she was worthy of the Cooper name. The meeting was arranged as a formal tea party at a wealthy associate's estate in Pasadena. Pasadena, at the time, was the bastion of old California money, a world away from the flashy, newly minted wealth of Hollywood. It was home to industrialists, bankers, and the kind of quiet, ruthless power that Rocky Balfe and Alice Cooper represented. When Patricia arrived at the estate, she walked into a trap. This was not a private, intimate introduction. Alice Cooper had engineered a public tribunal. The room was filled with Gary's family members, close friends, and prominent society figures, the very people who formed the defensive perimeter around his respectability. They were seated amidst antique furniture and silver tea services, a physical manifestation of the world Patricia was trying to enter. When Gary introduced Patricia to his mother, the temperature in the room plummeted. Alice Cooper did not offer a polite fake smile. She did not extend the basic courtesies expected in polite society. She weaponized her English manners, turning them into ice. Alice looked at Patricia Neal not as a human being, but as a smudge on a pristine ledger. She looked her up and down with an expression of unvarnished aristocratic disgust. The silence in the room was deafening. Every eye was on the 23-year-old actress, watching her burn under the magnifying glass of the matriarch. Then Alice spoke. The exact words have been debated, polished, and obscured by time, but the structural violence of the message was unmistakable. In front of the assembled crowd, in front of the son who cowered in the corner, Alice Cooper systematically dismantled Patricia Neal. She made it explicitly, brutally clear that Patricia was an interloper. She highlighted her status as a mere actress, drawing a sharp, impenetrable line between the labor class of the studios and the ruling class of the family. She referred to Rocky with glowing, pointed reverence, establishing the unshakable legitimacy of the wife. She treated Patricia with a specific chilling disdain reserved for a woman deemed to be a homewrecker, a prostitute, a temporary biological distraction that had overstayed its welcome. The message delivered at that Pasadena tea party was not just a mother's disapproval, it was a formal excommunication. Alice Cooper was telling Patricia Neal in front of the witnesses who mattered, "You will never be one of us. You will never have this wealth. You will never have this name. You are an employee who has forgotten her place. We own him. You are trespassing." Patricia Neal stood in the center of that opulent room, completely exposed. She looked to Gary for defense. She looked to the hero of High Noon to step forward, to take her hand, to tell his mother that he loved this woman and demanded she be treated with respect. Gary Cooper did nothing. He remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor, shrinking into the background. His passivity in that moment was the most violent act of the entire afternoon. By failing to intervene, he endorsed his mother's cruelty. He confirmed Patricia's illegitimate status. He proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that when forced to choose between the approval of his matriarchal infrastructure and the dignity of the woman he claimed to love, he would always choose the infrastructure. Patricia left the estate in Pasadena completely shattered. She had walked in hoping for integration. She walked out having survived a psychological firing squad. The drive back to her rented Hollywood apartment was a descent into the abyss. The delusion was finally agonizingly breaking. The combined assault from Rocky, Maria, and Alice had achieved its tactical objective. They had not only paralyzed Gary, they had initiated the systemic unraveling of Patricia Neal. The vibrant, fiercely intelligent stage actress who had arrived from New York a few years prior ceased to exist. In her place was a woman suffering from severe, untreated psychological trauma. The isolation orchestrated by Rocky's studio connections had starved her professionally. The hatred of a child had painted her as a monster. The public humiliation by the matriarch had stripped her of her dignity, and the cowardice of her lover had left her entirely without a protector in a city of wolves. Patricia Neal began to exhibit the clinical symptoms of profound stress. She developed insomnia, lying awake in the dark, jumping every time the telephone clicked. She suffered from panic attacks, her heart racing, her lungs unable to draw air, convinced that the entire machinery of Los Angeles was conspiring to crush her. She lost a shocking amount of weight, her cheekbones jutting out sharply, her eyes hollow and dark. She began to rely heavily on sleeping pills to force her brain to shut off and alcohol to numb the waking hours. She was 24 years old. She was entirely alone. She was the collateral damage of a corporate merger that refused to be dissolved. Gary continued to call, continued to whisper his miseries into the receiver, but the dynamic had shifted. He was no longer a captive hero waiting for rescue. He was a warden checking on a prisoner. He visited her apartment in secret, consumed by guilt and physical desire, but he brought the heavy, suffocating dread of his domestic life with him. The physical intimacy that had once been their escape now felt like a desperate, clawing attempt to ignore the reality closing in around them. The ecosystem of their affair had become toxic. They were trapped in a cycle of mutual destruction. Gary was destroying Patricia with his cowardice, and Patricia was destroying herself by refusing to walk away. She was suffering from the sunk cost fallacy. She had sacrificed her reputation, her professional standing, and her mental health for this man. To leave him now would be to admit that the destruction had been for nothing. It would be to admit that Rocky Balfe had won. She remained isolated, her entire existence reduced to waiting for sporadic calls from a man who was unwilling to step out of his heavily guarded reality. She stayed as the calendar turned into the autumn of 1950. She stayed, unaware that the psychological torture she had endured thus far was merely the prologue. The system had starved her, isolated her, and humiliated her. But the system had not yet demanded its pound of flesh. The system had not yet required a physical sacrifice to balance the ledger. That requirement was triggered in October 1950. The invisible tether that bound them finally manifested into a biological reality. The ultimate nightmare of the studio system, the absolute terror of the Hollywood public relations machine, and the final insurmountable obstacle to Gary Cooper's respectability arrived in silence. Patricia Neal missed her period. The warfare was about to move from the drawing rooms of Pasadena directly into the shadows of a clandestine surgical theater. The Hollywood machine was preparing to erase the physical evidence of its star's indiscretion, and the man who would sign the order, arrange the financing, and dictate the terms of the erasure would be the very man whose child was growing inside her. In the rigid Hollywood studio system of 1950, an unplanned pregnancy out of wedlock was not merely a personal crisis, it was a catastrophic breach of the morality clause. It was an existential threat that triggered the immediate ruthless activation of the industry's crisis management infrastructure. When Patricia Neal's biological cycle stopped, the abstract, romanticized tragedy of her affair with Gary Cooper crystallized into a harsh, undeniable physical reality. The secret was no longer contained in whispered phone calls or hidden hotel rooms. It was growing inside her. For a brief, delusional moment, Patricia experienced a surge of hope. She was 24 years old and deeply, irrationally in love with a man who had written her hundreds of letters promising a family. She operated under the theatrical logic that this biological fact would force the hero's hand. The child would be the catalyst. Gary Cooper would finally have to stop hiding. He would have to leave Rocky Balfe, face the public, and claim the woman and the child that belonged to him. She believed that the sheer, undeniable reality of new life would shatter the artificial corporate structure that kept them apart. She was catastrophically wrong. The biological reality did not shatter the corporate structure. It triggered its most lethal defense mechanisms. When Patricia told Gary Cooper the news, the reaction was not one of a conflicted lover or a proud father. The color drained from his face. The man who had written her endless letters, who had wept on the phone about his miserable marriage, vanished. He didn't see a child. He saw headlines, shattered contracts, and public ruin. The romantic illusion evaporated, leaving only a brutal reality. He was ordering her to undergo an illegal, life-threatening surgical procedure to protect his myth. Patricia attempted to resist. She pleaded. She argued. She was raised in the South. The moral and religious implications of abortion terrified her. But she was fighting a war she had already lost. She was isolated. She had no money, no powerful family, and her career had already been systematically crippled by Rocky Balfe's shadow campaign. If she defied Gary and had the child, she would be destitute, blacklisted, and publicly destroyed as a homewrecker. She was trapped in a completely enclosed system where every exit led to her ruin. Ultimately, the crushing weight of Cooper's absolute refusal broke her. She surrendered. She agreed to the procedure, sacrificing her own biological child to buy the safety and approval of a man who was too cowardly to stand by her. The logistics of an abortion in Hollywood in 1950 were a master class in hypocrisy. While the studios publicly promoted family values and the morality clauses strictly forbade immoral acts, the industry internally maintained a highly efficient shadow infrastructure designed to erase the mistakes of its stars. Every major studio had a network of fixers, lawyers, and discreet medical professionals whose sole job was to perform illicit surgeries, clean up hotel rooms, and pay off witnesses. Gary Cooper did not utilize his own name. He did not walk into a hospital. He utilized the shadow network. He made the necessary phone calls. He arranged the appointment. He secured the financing, which, for an illegal procedure performed on a high-profile actress, required a significant amount of untraceable cash. But the ultimate display of Cooper's profound cowardice occurred on the day of the procedure itself. When the time came for Patricia Neal to undergo the physical and psychological trauma of terminating her pregnancy, Gary Cooper did not accompany her. He could not risk being seen. He could not risk his face being associated with the clinic. The American hero, the man who made his fortune projecting an image of unshakable courage, stayed hidden in the safety of his world. Instead, he outsourced the task. He sent a proxy. Patricia Neal was picked up by a driver, a silent, anonymous functionary of the Hollywood machine. She was placed in the back of a car and driven through the sprawling, sun-drenched streets of Los Angeles. The isolation was absolute. She was a 24-year-old woman, terrified, grieving, and entirely alone, being transported like a piece of defective equipment to a repair facility. The destination was not a modern, sterile hospital. It was a discreet, nondescript location, often a shabby medical office or a private residence converted for the purpose. These were the clinical realities of the Golden Age. Behind the Adrian gowns and the Technicolor lighting lay the smell of ether, iodine, and desperation. When Patricia entered the clinic, she was stripped of her remaining dignity. There was no preoperative counseling. There was no empathetic bedside manner. The doctor performing the procedure was not interested in her emotional state. He was executing a highly paid contract. The atmosphere was industrial. She was laid out on a cold examination table. The reality of what was about to happen, the violent physical removal of the life she had briefly hoped would save her, crashed down upon her. The anesthesia was administered. The world went dark. When Patricia Neal woke up, the surgery was complete. The child was gone. The physical evidence of Gary Cooper's infidelity had been scraped away and discarded. The threat to his pristine image had been surgically neutralized, leaving a 24-year-old girl bleeding alone in a rented apartment. But the psychological annihilation of Patricia Neal had just begun. She woke up in a state of profound, hollow emptiness. The physical pain of the procedure was dwarfed by a crushing, immediate wave of grief and betrayal. As the anesthesia wore off, the brutal clarity of the situation set in. She had allowed the system to mutilate her body to protect a man who had not even possessed the courage to hold her hand while it happened. She was driven back to her rented Hollywood apartment by the same silent proxy. She walked through the door and collapsed into a bed that felt like a tomb. She was bleeding, she was exhausted, and she was utterly alone. Patricia Neal lay in a dark room, her body recovering from an illegal trauma, weeping for a child that she had been forced to erase. Her mind was fracturing under the weight of guilt, isolation, and the realization that she had been utterly discarded. A few miles away, in the manicured, fortified estate in Brentwood, Gary Cooper sat down to dinner. He sat at the head of a long, polished table. He looked at his wife, Rocky, who had orchestrated the social starvation of his lover. He looked at his daughter, Maria, who had been weaponized to secure his compliance. He ate his meal. He maintained the facade. The crisis had been averted. The Gary Cooper brand was safe. His bank accounts were untouched. His reputation remained spotless. He had paid the fee, outsourced the violence, and returned to his monument. The abortion of October 1950 was the definitive turning point in the tragedy. It was the moment the illusion of romantic love was violently replaced by the cold, mechanical reality of industrial power. Well, for Patricia Neal, the aftermath of the clinic was not a recovery. It was a descent into a psychological abyss from which she would never fully emerge. The procedure did not just remove a pregnancy, it shattered her. The panic attacks that began under Rocky's shadow campaign now mutated into a constant vibrating terror. She could not sleep. When she closed her eyes, the sterile lights of the clinic flashed in her mind. She heard the clinking of surgical instruments. She was haunted by the phantom presence of the child. She began to view herself not as a victim, but as a murderer. The Catholic guilt ingrained in Gary Cooper had transferred to her. Magnified by the physical reality of the act, she had traded a life for a lie. To cope with the unbearable noise in her head, she turned to the only anesthetics available to a discarded Hollywood actress: alcohol and pills. She drank to numb the grief. She took barbiturates to force herself into unconsciousness. Her physical appearance deteriorated rapidly. The vibrant, ferocious stage actress was gone. In her place was a ghost, a thin, fragile, hollow-eyed woman wandering the fringes of an industry that had collectively decided to look the other way. And what did the machine do with this broken asset? The studio system, having protected its primary investment in Gary Cooper, now needed to manage the fallout of the secondary asset. Warner Brothers looked at Patricia Neal. They saw the weight loss. They saw the dark circles under her eyes. They saw the erratic, depressed behavior. They did not offer psychiatric help. They did not offer a leave of absence. They offered a termination of contract. She was no longer profitable. The look had faded. The intensity was now viewed as instability. The industry that had chewed her up now proceeded to spit her out. Her roles diminished. The scripts stopped coming. The phone, which she used to stare at for hours waiting for Gary to call, went entirely silent. Gary Cooper, having secured his survival, began his slow, cowardly retreat. The affair did not end immediately. It bled out. He still called occasionally, but the dynamic was irrevocably poisoned. Every time he looked at Patricia, he did not see the passionate girl he had met on the set of The Fountainhead. He saw his own guilt. He saw the physical reminder of his cowardice. He saw the trauma he had inflicted. And because Gary Cooper abhorred discomfort above all else, he began to pull away. He cited the pressure from Rocky. He cited his health. He cited the studio. Faced with the wreckage of the affair, Cooper quietly orchestrated his own retreat, utilizing every available excuse to ensure his public respectability remained untarnished. Patricia shattered and heavily medicated, watched him retreat. The finality of the betrayal was absolute. She realized with the clarity of a victim who has survived the slaughterhouse that he was never going to leave his wife. He had never intended to. The letters, the promises, the tears, they were all part of the performance. He had demanded the ultimate sacrifice from her, not to build a life together, but to ensure he could return comfortably to his old one. By the end of 1951, Patricia Neal had nothing left. She had lost her lover. She had lost her child. She had lost her career in Hollywood. She had lost her mental stability. Faced with total annihilation, she made the only choice left for a woman exiled by the empire. She ran. She packed her bags with the frantic, disjointed energy of a survivor escaping a burning building. She crossed the Atlantic Ocean, not to find a new career, but to establish a geographical quarantine between herself and the machinery that had nearly killed her. Her destination was London, but the machine did not care that she left. The status quo was restored. Back in Hollywood, the Gary Cooper myth continued to generate revenue. The magazines printed glossy photographs of Gary and Rocky at charity galas, praising their enduring marriage. The blood had been scrubbed from the floor. In London, however, trauma was a silent disease. For a woman who had undergone a forced abortion orchestrated by an American icon, there were no therapists to whom she could safely confess the truth. To speak was to invite further destruction. She was forced to swallow the entire weight of the atrocity alone. She moved into cold English flats and returned to the stage, but the instrument was damaged. Her performances were now colored by a dark, vibrating frequency of unsimulated grief. The nights were the true battleground. She suffered from relentless night terrors, haunted by the sterile smell of the clinic and the phantom existence of the child that had not been permitted to live. She did not just grieve the loss of a pregnancy, she grieved the murder of a future. The Catholic adjacent morality that Gary Cooper had exploited to protect himself now embedded itself in Patricia's psyche. She convinced herself she was fundamentally corrupted. To silence this internal tribunal, she turned to alcohol and barbiturates. There were nights in London where she would sit alone, heavily intoxicated, staring at the walls, weeping hysterically for the infant that Gary Cooper's accountants had classified as a liability. This specific visceral grief would haunt Patricia Neal for more than 3 decades. The system had crushed her, extracted what it needed, and left her to manage the lifelong psychological bleeding completely alone. While Patricia Neal was self-destructing in exile, the Hollywood machinery initiated the rehabilitation of its primary asset. Gary Cooper needed to be stabilized. The affair, though contained, had caused structural tremors in his public facade. The studio fixers, the PR departments, and Veronica Rocky Balfe recognized that the public narrative required a masterful redirection. The strategy they deployed was a masterstroke of cinematic irony. They decided to hide Gary Cooper's profound, debilitating cowardice behind the greatest performance of moral courage in the history of American film. In 1951, as Patricia was fleeing to Europe, Gary Cooper stepped onto a soundstage to film High Noon. The parallel between High Noon and Cooper's reality was grotesque. In the film, Cooper plays Will Kane, a newly married town marshal who discovers that a gang of killers is arriving on the noon train to murder him. He asks the townspeople, his friends, his deputies, his judge for help. One by one, they abandon him out of fear and self-interest. Kane is left completely alone, forced to face the killers to protect his honor and his town, knowing he will likely die. When Cooper filmed these scenes, his face was lined with genuine exhaustion. His eyes conveyed a deep, agonizing panic. He looked like a man who was being crushed by the weight of the world. The director, Fred Zinnemann, utilized this physical deterioration to brilliant effect. The camera lingered on Cooper's sweating face, capturing the essence of a man standing entirely alone against an insurmountable threat. The critics hailed it as a masterpiece of acting, the definitive portrayal of American bravery facing death. They were entirely wrong. Gary Cooper was not acting. The exhaustion etched into his face on celluloid was remarkably real, though its exact source remains debated. Medical records and some historians attribute his frail appearance to severe bleeding ulcers and chronic back pain. However, many biographers suggest that the psychological toll of his fractured personal life inevitably bled into his performance. He was a man projecting the deep, agonizing internal conflicts of someone trapped by his own choices. The studio system took this display of genuine pain and masterfully packaged it as heroic virtue. They marketed High Noon as the ultimate testament to Gary Cooper's unshakable moral core, and the public, desperate for heroes in the anxious climate of the Cold War, bought it entirely. The propaganda was so effective that in 1953, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences awarded Gary Cooper his second Oscar for Best Actor. The contrast was staggering. In London, Patricia Neal was drinking herself to sleep, her career in shambles, her body traumatized, haunted by the child she had been forced to abort. In Los Angeles, Gary Cooper stood on a brightly lit stage, clutching a golden statue, universally adored as the absolute paragon of masculine courage. The system had not merely protected the abuser, it had rewarded him. It had weaponized his guilt and turned it into profit. The whitewashing was complete. The blood was invisible. The monument was gleaming. But a monument is not a marriage. And Rocky Balboa was not a woman who accepted temporary truces. With the public narrative secured and the threat of Patricia Neal geographically neutralized, Rocky turned her attention to the final phase of her corporate strategy, the formal reacquisition of the asset. Between 1951 and 1953, Gary and Rocky had lived in a state of formal, though highly publicized, separation. Rocky had utilized this separation as a disciplinary measure. She allowed Gary to feel the cold, terrifying reality of life without her infrastructure. She allowed him to live in hotels, to manage his own schedule, to face the Catholic Church's disapproval without her protective shield. She starved him of the respectability he craved above all else. She knew Gary Cooper. She knew he lacked the internal architecture to function independently. He was a man who required a warden. By 1954, the discipline had achieved its desired effect. Gary was exhausted, isolated, and desperate to return to the fortress. The rebellion was over. The host had been thoroughly broken. The reconciliation of Gary and Rocky Cooper in 1954 was not a romantic reunion. It was a negotiated settlement. It was the signing of a new treaty in which the terms of surrender were absolute. The press, carefully managed by Rocky's network, reported the reconciliation as a triumph of Catholic family values. They printed glowing articles about the couple finding their way back to each other, praising Rocky's immense patience and forgiveness. Photographs were distributed showing them smiling together, the perfect, sophisticated, aristocratic couple, their daughter Maria standing happily between them. The reality was a chilling subjugation. Gary Cooper returned to the Brentwood mansion not as an equal partner, but as a defeated employee. The balance of power, which had always tilted heavily toward Rocky, was now entirely unilateral. Rocky had proven that she could destroy his life, his reputation, and his lovers with a few phone calls. She had proven that she held the absolute monopoly on his respectability. Cooper accepted these terms. He traded whatever remained of his emotional autonomy for the security of his millions and the preservation of his myth. He surrendered to the Iron Fist. The High Noon hero lived the rest of his life as a highly paid hostage in his own home. He continued to make films, continued to project the image of the stoic independent American, while returning every evening to a woman who owned him completely. This is the ultimate victory of the Hollywood studio system and the upper-class power structure it served. They did not just manage scandals, they engineered realities. They possessed the power to take a coward, a man who forced a secret abortion to protect his wealth, and universally successfully rebrand him as the moral compass of a nation. They possessed the power to take a fiercely intelligent, independent young woman, strip her of her child, her career, and her sanity, and erase her entirely from the official history. In 1961, Gary Cooper succumbed to cancer. His final days were meticulously curated by Rocky's unwavering public relations machinery. Global obituaries cemented his myth as the ultimate American hero, praising his integrity and his enduring marriage. The brutal realities of 1950 were entirely redacted, sealing his legacy in marble. Across the ocean, Patricia Neal read the news in silence. She carried the psychological shrapnel of their shared history alone, never shattering his pristine image. The world mourned a flawless hero who existed only on celluloid, while the woman who paid the true cost of that illusion kept his darkest secret.